EBIT EPS analysis. So this would involve a method that covers the effects of leverage involving comparison of financing methods under EBIT assumptions. That is to say, a firm has the choice of raising funds by financing its investment proposals from various sources in different magnitudes. For instance, it can exclusively use equity capital, which in this case there will never be any debt. Firm can also exclusively use debt. It can exclusively use preference capital, use a combination of debt and equity, and use a combination of equity, debt, and preference shares, and so on. So no matter whatever combination it uses for a given level of EBIT or earnings, the right combination should be one which would maximize the EPS or earnings per share. So we will illustrate this by taking an example. So in this EBIT EPS analysis, the illustration we are giving is, suppose a firm has capital structure exclusively comprising of ordinary shares amounting to rupees 1 lakh or 100,000. The firm wishes to raise an additional rupees 100,000 or 1 lakh for expansion. So the firm has four alternate plans. Plan A is that it is based on entirely equity shares. So whatever it is going to raise, that is 100,000 rupees, it is going to raise all based on equity shares. Plan B is such that it raises 50% by equity shares and 50% by 5% debentures. Plan C is it raises the entire amount by 6% debentures. And plan D is that it raises 50% equity shares and 50% by 5% preference share capital. So we will actually see what are the different parameters here which is there for EPS. So ultimately we have to find out the earnings per share for all the four plans. So first plan is it's entirely equity. So how much it is going to raise? It is going to raise 100,000 rupees. What is the EBIT? So assume that we also have existing EBITs 12,000 rupees with tax rate 35% and outstanding ordinary shares which is 100, which means there are 100 shares already outstanding, and the market price for share is rupees 1,000 for all the different plans. So the EBIT earnings currently is for all the four plans, it's the same, it is 12,000 rupees. So that is the EBIT. Now in plan A, we will first take what are the different values. So EBIT is 12,000. There is no interest because it's the capital is raised entirely by equity shares. So there is no debenture, so there is no interest. So earnings before taxes, which is 12,000 again, since there are no interest. Now taxes, it is there because 35% tax rate is there. So 35% of earnings before taxes, it will be 4,200. Earnings after taxes will be 7,800. And there is no preference dividend for plan A, so there is no amount there. Earnings available to equity shareholders is 7,800. Since the entire amount is raised, that is 100,000 is raised by equity shares, and there are 100 outstanding shares. So how much more will be there? So we are going to raise 100,000 with 1,000 is the equity share price. So there will be 100 more shares which we will raise since it is entirely equity in plan A. So totally there is 100 outstanding and 100 from whatever we want to raise, which will be 200. So there will be totally 200 shares. So here in plan A, we got earnings available to ordinary shareholders, which is 7,800, and then there are 200 shares, which makes the earnings per share 39. Now let us take a look at plan B. Plan B is, it is raising 50% by equity shares and 50% by 5% debentures. How much are we going to raise? It is 100,000 we are going to raise for expansion, out of which 50% is by equity shares and 50% is by 5% debentures. So since there is debentures involved, there is 5% interest on 50%. So what is the total interest? The total interest in plan B is 2,500. So we lessen that from EBIT. Then we get 9,500. There is 35% tax on 9,500, which would make the tax amount as 3,325, which means the earnings after tax is 6,175. Now, what is the earnings available to ordinary shareholders? It is 6,175. Now, what about the number of shares? 1,000 is totally we want to we are raising for expansion, out of which it is 50% by 5% debentures and 50% by equity shares. So 50% of, so out of the 100 outstanding shares are there already, with 50,000 being raised because 50% equity shares. Each share value is 1,000, which means there are 50 more shares which we are raising. So total shares would be 150. So earnings available to ordinary shareholders in plan B is 6,175. Number of shares is 150, which would make the earnings per share 41.17. Now in plan C, we are raising entire amount by 6% debentures, which means there is interest. 6% interest is there for debentures. Entire amount is 100,000 rupees, which we are raising. 6% debentures, which would make interest to be 6,000. And the difference is the earnings before taxes, which is 6,000. Taxes is 35% on 6,000, which would be 2,100. So the earnings after taxes will be 3,900. So what is earnings available to ordinary shareholders? It is 3,900. Since we are raising debentures for the entire 100,000 rupees, what is the number of shares there? It is only 100, which is only the outstanding shares, which is what is the number of shares. So 3,900 is earnings available to ordinary shareholders from plan C, and 100 shares are outstanding, which would mean the earnings per share is 39. And in the last plan, which is plan D, it is raising 50% by equity shares and 50% by 5% preference share capital. So the total amount which is going to be raised is 100,000 rupees. EBIT is 12,000 in plan D. Earning, there are no interest because no debentures are there. It's only equity shares and preference share capital. Earnings before taxes is the same as whatever EBIT is, which is 12,000, since there is no interest. Now taxes, if you want to calculate, it is 35% on 12,000, which is the earnings, which will be 4,200. So the earnings after taxes is 7,800. Now what we have is, there is preference share capital. 50% equities, 50% is raised by 5% preference share capital, which would mean of 100,000 rupees which is getting raised, the preference dividend will be 5% of 50%, which is 50,000, and the preference share is 2,500, which is the preference dividend. So earnings after taxes minus preference dividend, we get the earnings available to shareholders as 5,300. What are the total number of shares? We are raising 50% by equity shares. So for out of the total 100,000 which is needed for expansion, 50% is raised by equity shares, which would make it 50 shares. So totally 100 outstanding shares plus 50 shares would be 150 shares. So that is the number of shares. Now the earnings per share is, earnings available to ordinary shareholders is 5,300 divided by 150, which will be 35.33. So one thing which you have to note is that the earnings per share is maximum. See, that is what we are trying to do. We are trying to maximize the EPS or earnings per share or value of the firm, which is maximum for plan B, which is basically nothing but raising 50% by equity shares and 50% by 5% debentures. So that is what is revealed by this EBIT EPS analysis. This example is worked out and it is available from the reference section. Thank you.